Who got it? It's a strawberry, right? Well, hey, welcome to church. Those of you who are online, thank you for checking us out online. For those of you who are exploring faith, we know it takes a lot of courage to come to church. So we are grateful that you have joined us today. My name is Kevin. I'm one of the pastors on staff, and it is such a privilege to be able to bring this final sermon in this awesome sermon series called Superfoods. And this has been a sermon series that has been going through the book of Proverbs. Now, I want to begin with a story about two different schools, the University of Alabama and Auburn University. Now, both of these schools reside in the United States of America. Specifically, both of these schools are in the state of Alabama. And in the state of Alabama, there's only one thing that matters: American football. American football. So this, you don't have to understand American football to understand just how crazy this story is. Okay, so let me give you a little bit of background to help you understand the story. Number one, Alabama and Auburn have a rivalry that has existed for well over 100 years. So the hatred between the two schools is deep. And so parents will often pass down their hatred of the other school to their children. The second thing you gotta know is that American colleges love their traditions. They love their traditions. Some of these traditions are very silly, but it's very important to the life of the church. If you want to show your allegiance to a school, don't show them that you got a degree from the school. Show them that you know the traditions. That's how you belong. So this is just a little side nugget for those of you first-year college students. Get immersed with the traditions of your school, okay? So to the story, Auburn University. At the edge of Auburn University is a place called Toomer's Corner. And Toomer's Corner has these beautiful oak trees. Now, Auburn has this tradition where after every single football victory, all the students would gather at this corner called Toomer's Corner, and they would throw toilet paper into the trees. These beautiful, majestic oak trees, they would just throw toilet paper there. Now, there's a historical reason for why they do that. I won't get into it, but they've been doing it for over 100 years. So these trees have come to symbolize the success of their football program, okay? So in 2010, there is an Alabama fan named Harvey Updike. And he is a huge Alabama fan, didn't actually go to the University of Alabama. He's actually 60 years old, never went to the university, but he was a huge Alabama football fan. And so in that year, in 2010, Alabama loses a very important game to Auburn. And so Harvey is really upset, super upset, that he decides to take matters into his own hands, and he goes all the way to Auburn University, to Toomer's Corner, armed with an herbicide called Spike 80DF. And with that herbicide, he proceeds to poison these trees. Now, it seems like an innocent little prank, only the poison was so potent that it not only killed off these 130-year-old majestic oak trees that have been a part of the school since its very inception, but the poison actually seeped its way into the water supply of the city and made the water hazardous to all the residents. So it was no longer a prank. This was a terrorist act. So he was arrested. He was fined $800,000 and had to spend several years in prison, all because his team lost. Fandom makes us do crazy things, right? Fandom makes us really upset, and we'll do the craziest things in the name of our team. But if you think this is relegated to the world of sports, you'd be wrong, because we as humans will find any opportunity to be mad about something. For instance, Android users hate Apple users for some reason. Android users will find every opportunity to tell me how great their customizable UI is, right? And every time I tell them that I like to overpay for my underpowered, very generic Apple iPhone because I like the iOS ecosystem, I can see that they get viscerally upset. They're mad about a brand. Or how about anger over generational differences? Older generations can't stand younger generations because of their work ethic and entitlement. Younger generations can't stand older generations because of their refusal to change. And this leads to a lot of workplace conflicts and workplace drama. What about politics? The political right can't stand the political left because they're far too progressive. They're pushing these policies that are way too idealistic, too unrealistic, and frankly, just too expensive. The political left can't stand the political right because they're far too regressive. They push these policies that only care about the bottom line, that don't really care about those who are impoverished and underserved. See, anger is all around us. And lately, it seems like this world has reached a new fever pitch, like a new level of intensity in our anger. Groups are upset at other groups, and they're actually escalating their acts of aggression towards each other. Some are even radicalizing to acts of violence. Our families no longer are one single unit. They're broken apart because family members can't talk to one another because of their ideological differences. We live in an age of rage. Doesn't it seem like our world is perpetually mad at everything and everyone? Doesn't it seem like no two people can truly get along because they will inevitably find something that they disagree about? And this is not just a societal issue, it's actually seeping its way into our psyche, seeping its way into the way we think. I find myself more cynical than ever. I'm more easily triggered by small things that people say and small things that they do. And when I am triggered, I'm angry for a much longer period of time. And this anger just nags away at me until there's something else that I can be upset about. Maybe you can relate with me. And whether it's because of the power of social media or the 24/7 news cycle of outrage, whether we know it or not, we are being swept up by this fervor, influenced by this age of rage. How did we get here? What can we do about this? I can think of no better way than to end our sermon series on the book of Proverbs by looking at what the book of Proverbs says about this cultural moment that we find ourselves in. This cultural moment I'm calling the age of rage. So I'm titling this sermon, Wisdom in the Age of Rage. And we're going to be camped out in two verses, Proverbs chapter 22, verse 24 to 25. But before I dive into that text, I want to dispel some misconceptions over the emotion of anger. So let me begin here. Is anger wrong? Well, the answer from a biblical standpoint is not so clear-cut, okay? So one of the famous passages on anger is Ephesians chapter 4, verse 26. In your anger, do not sin. Do not let the sun go down while you are still angry, and do not give the devil a foothold. There's no prohibition in this verse against being angry, right? In fact, it kind of gives us a best practice of what we can do when we are angry. Paul, the writer of this, says, do not let the sun go down while you are still angry. That's his command. So Emily and I have really tried to hold to this, but it's been impossible. Because frankly, there are fights that last longer than a day. And if you always try to rush a resolution before the sunsets, especially in the winter, right? It's setting even sooner. It's really hard, and sometimes you come to a resolution that won't actually work for you, right? But there's a principle behind this that is, I think, really important for us to catch. If anger is left to fester, if anger just stews through the night, the longer it stews, the more opportunity you give for the devil to gain a foothold, to draw you into sin. It's not that anger is wrong. It's that it's unwise to let your anger fester because it'll draw you into sin. That's what this verse says. How about this verse? James chapter 1, verse 19. My dear brothers and sisters, take note of this. Everyone should be quick to listen, slow to speak, and slow to become angry, because human anger does not produce the righteousness that God desires. Again, no prohibition against being angry. Only we are told to be slow in our anger. Because human anger has a tendency to be reactive. It doesn't stop to listen. It just shoots off at the mouth. James says something about that in verse 26. He says, those who consider themselves religious and yet do not keep a tight rein on their tongues deceive themselves, and their religion is worthless. If your anger causes you to just shoot off at the mouth, to say something you don't mean that might hurt somebody, your religion is misguided. Sometimes we've gotten it into our heads, dear Christians, that we need to angrily defend our positions, that we need to angrily defend the truth. And James says, no, that's misguided. That's not true religion. That's not going to lead to the type of righteousness you think it'll lead you to. True religion, what God cares about is that you care for the orphans and widows. That's true religion, not that you have to defend the truth angrily. So that's what this verse says. So anger is not wrong. Just don't let it fester because it can draw you into sin. And don't react quickly. Be slow to anger, because if you're not slow to anger, it's not going to lead to the righteousness that you think it'll lead you to. But the ultimate reason for why anger is okay is because Jesus displays it, right? So when he walks into Jerusalem and he goes into the temple and he sees the money changers there turning the temple into a marketplace, he flips the tables. But there's an interesting detail that is captured in the Gospel of John that I think we need to pay attention to. John chapter 2, verse 15. So he made a whip out of cords and drove out all from the temple courts, both sheep and cattle. He scattered the coins of the money changers and overturned their tables. He made a whip. Can you imagine that? Jesus sitting down there making a whip. Like, as furious as he was and as mad as he was, he sat down and pulled two cords, several cords, and made a whip. I don't know how long that takes or how long it takes to braid a whip together, but he took time to do that. And then he drove everyone out. So his anger was not quick, it was slow. It didn't fester. He didn't just bury it under some rug and not deal with it. He actually dealt with his anger. So anger is good. There's a psychologist named James Averill, and he's a professor at the University of Massachusetts. And he is the first to really do extensive research into the emotion of anger. And he says that anger is the most dense form of communication. And what he means by that is this: anger will convey more information more quickly than any other emotion. If someone is angry, you pay attention, right? It does an excellent job at getting people to pay attention and to confront things that they would otherwise avoid. But here's the problem. It used to be that our worlds were a lot smaller. We lived in our village or a town, and that was it. You knew everybody in town. And so when you were mad at someone, you were likely going to go to that person and resolve that issue. Anger, in that sense, is a very good emotion. It causes you to seek resolution. But now our world is much larger, and it's at our fingertips. There's so many more things for us to get angry about, and we don't no longer direct it at specific people. We direct it at these distant groups that are easy to demonize. Again, it's very easy if I'm mad at a friend, I'm going to go and resolve that issue, right? Because we know each other. But if I'm angry at these distant groups or some arbitrary structure in society or some governmental issue that I have no control over, I can't resolve that anger. And that anger festers. And when anger festers, it becomes a desire for revenge. How does that work? Well, anger can turn into moral outrage. Moral outrage is essentially anger over injustices. A term we might use here in church is righteous indignation. This is actually a very good force for change, a very good force for doing good. It propels people. But if we start to lose faith that our moral outrage is being heard, or that our moral outrage is actually producing results, it's going to fester and become a desire for revenge, a desire to see other people hurt. It's very important that we pay attention to this pattern. Anger becomes moral outrage. And when this moral outrage festers, it becomes this desire for revenge, okay? And this is where our proverb comes in. Proverbs chapter 22, verse 24. Do not make friends with a hot-tempered person. Do not associate with one easily angered. The Hebrew for hot-tempered person is actually owner of nose. Those are the words. The literal words are owner of nose. And this is a visual picture of someone who has a scrunched up nose, flared out nostrils, completely red in the face. It's a stereotype of someone who has a short fuse who will just blow up at any moment's notice and destroy everything, okay? Don't make friends with the owner of this nose. Second part of the verse. Do not associate with one easily angered. Again, I'm going to do a rough translation of the Hebrew word by word to point out something specific. So I'm going to translate it as, do not get involved with a man of wrath. That's the word for word translation. Now I want to point us to this verb, to get involved. The Hebrew is tivo, which means to enter into. So quite literally, this verse should be translated, do not enter into the anger of the man of wrath. That's very clunky to say, which is why we don't do that. But when we parse it out, we are able to catch the message of what they're saying. Don't enter into the anger of this man. How do we enter into someone's anger? Quite literally, I think for us right now, it is to step into the anger of this age, the anger of the world. Because the anger of this world is an anger without catharsis. Catharsis means to release. In other words, it is an anger that festers and festers and festers and festers and festers without any opportunity for release at all. And to be fair, the structures of society, the world that we live in, have done a great job at exacerbating this anger. It's done a great job at making this anger worse because it is profitable. There's a term called corporatized outrage, and it essentially means this. You can manipulate anger for the purpose of profits, and companies and industries have manipulated anger for the purpose of profits. And nowhere is this more evident than in the media industry. In 1987, there was a reporter named Gerald Rivera. He had a daytime talk show. It was terrible. Nobody listened. Nobody watched. Ratings were awful. And so he decided to bring two opposing groups onto his set. He brought in white supremacists and black activists onto the same show to hash out their differences. Well, a fight would ensue. The whole set was trashed. Everything was terrible. And the ratings went through the roof. And so he started to do that more. He brought more people, more groups that were opposed to one another, and they would hash it out and they would fight. And it came to characterize daytime television in the 90s. People just fighting all the time. And cable networks, cable news agencies were watching. They were saying, wow, that's pretty cool. And they joined the fray. And so all these networks now essentially have a similar strategy. And that's this. Number one, you tap into the moral outrage of people. That's going to get them watching. Number two, keep them angry. And number three, most important of all, don't give them catharsis. Don't give them any release, because that's how you keep them tuned in. And with the advent of social media platforms like TikTok, Twitter, YouTube, Instagram, it's only made matters worse, because the very definition of success on these social media platforms is to get people to click. If you want to be a social media influencer, it's really easy. The concept is simple. Get people to click on your video and watch your video for a long time. And the best way to do that is to use outrage. Tweet something offensive or post a reaction video to some shocking event. It's a vicious cycle, but it's really, really profitable. And so when the proverb says, don't enter into the anger of this man of wrath, I think we have to realize that the man of wrath is really the world around us. I also think we have to realize that we inadvertently step into the anger of this man unknowingly by simply turning on our phones. By turning on, because that's what we consume on a daily basis. I find myself, after spending just a few minutes on my phone, more agitated, angry about something I wasn't even thinking about before I turned my phone on. Don't enter into that anger, because there will be a consequence. Proverbs 22 says, or you may learn their ways and get yourself ensnared. You will learn their ways. I hope this has been clear so far. The pattern of anger is what we learn. Anger turns into moral outrage. This can be a force for good, but usually it just festers and there's no opportunity for catharsis, for release. And so when this keeps festering, it turns into this desire for revenge. You live life long enough like this, and the pattern for anger becomes your pattern for life. What I mean is this. You start to just be this angry person, and you're no longer just angry at specific issues. Your anger is how you approach life. You ever been with someone who turns everything into a moral offense? Like they're mad that their coffee order was wrong because they think the barista is sexist or racist. I mean, come on, right? It's so tiring. I can't hang out with someone like that because I'm always worried about saying something that might trigger them in the wrong way. You associate with the man of wrath, and you will adopt the pattern for revenge, pattern for anger, as the pattern for life. You will learn their ways. The second thing that'll happen is that you will be ensnared. Now, again, I did a word-for-word translation of the Hebrew. It actually means fetch a trap, which is very interesting because you don't normally go fetching a trap, right? Traps are supposed to surprise you. They spring up on you. But to fetch a trap is to actually go and search for a trap. And we search for a trap when we seek revenge. There's this term called the revenge impulse. And the revenge impulse is a cycle of recrimination, rumination, and ever-expanding fury. Lots of words there. Let me define them all for you, okay? So recrimination means to make an accusation out of retaliation. So the very motivation for your accusation is simply to hurt the other person. This will lead you to rumination. Rumination means you just can't stop thinking about the thing that you're angry about. And this is because perhaps your accusation doesn't truly satisfy your need for revenge. Or you make an accusation and they make an accusation back at you and it's back and forth and you're constantly thinking about the thing you're angry about, right? So that's rumination, and that leads to an ever-expanding fury. This is when you just get mad at everything. You get triggered at everything. And that will likely lead to further recriminations. And you're caught in this terrible cycle, this terrible whirlwind of revenge. Now, I feel like I have to say this. Often we think of anger and revenge as deeply intertwined, but they are in fact two distinct emotions. Anger is not the thing that keeps you ensnared. But anger, if you don't deal with it, if you let it fester, it leads us into this impulse for revenge, and that very much is a trap. Now, in society, this happens when we feel that our institutions that should be working for us no longer work for us. They've broken down. When we feel like justice is unattainable. When we feel that our moral outrage is not being heard. That's when we step into this revenge impulse and we ensnare ourselves. And we're caught in this cycle. And eventually, the longer we're in this revenge cycle, we will want to burn everything down. Or worse, we will long for others to be hurt. You want to know how you can know if you're caught in this cycle? You will actually gloat and celebrate when misfortune falls on another group of people, especially if they're your enemies. Proverbs chapter 24 says this, "Do not gloat when your enemy falls. When they stumble, do not let your heart rejoice, or the Lord will see and disapprove and turn his wrath away from them." The proverb right before this in verse 15 and 16 are all about how the wicked will fall. And so in totality, it's saying the wicked will fall, but don't gloat over that. Don't celebrate over that. Because the Lord finds your desire for revenge so repulsive that he would rather turn his justice away, turn his wrath away from the wicked, than to give you any reason to nurse your revenge. So what do we do? So what now? Because the world in which this proverb was written was a very different world. Okay, not to say it was easier, but it was a different world, at least in terms of avoiding the angry man. You could do it. You just walk on the other side of the town. Maybe you leave town. You just go home and shut the door, and that's it. But the world in which we live right now, anger is all around us. It's in what we read, what we watch, what we peruse through. Even if we were to go into our homes, it doesn't silence the voices. You would think that after 3 years of being isolated in our homes, we'd be a less angry society. But that's not true, right? Because when we were locked into our own homes, if we weren't interacting with family members that we were getting frustrated at, the only associations we were making were with people and influencers on the internet and on the news. And they were always mad. So how do we escape? How do we get out? How do we avoid this age of rage? I say we break the pattern. We break the pattern. I hope you've seen by now that the issue really isn't anger. And I hope you're also able to see that it's not so much about avoiding the angry person as much as it is about escaping this age of rage, escaping this whole ecosystem that feeds on our anger, that tries to keep us angry. And to that, I think God does provide a way. Romans chapter 12, verse 19 says, "Do not take revenge, my dear friends, but leave room for God's wrath. For it is written, 'It is mine to avenge, I will repay,' says the Lord." Revenge is not our responsibility. The desire for revenge should never be on our hearts, on our minds, because what should be on our minds is that God will have his vengeance and that he will repay. This is how you break the pattern of anger in our lives. You see, where anger goes wrong is that it festers and festers and festers until it is able to get some sort of revenge. But if you are able to remove the desire for revenge because you truly believe this, that God will have his vengeance and that he will repay, it satisfies this moral outrage. It stops it. It stops anger right in its tracks. But I know what you want to say and what you want to counter. That's unrealistic. Kevin, you don't know me. You don't know what I'm going through. You don't know what I'm upset about. That to say that God will have his vengeance, that seems irresponsible and lazy at best. And I think we think this way because we don't know how to truly believe that God will have his justice. We don't. We don't know how to actually believe this when we say it. But what if there was a way to change that? It's not going to happen all at once, but I believe there is a way to gradually believe that God will have his justice, and it's not going to be in a way that you would suspect. It's going to be through Sabbath. What's a day got to do with this? What's Sunday got to do with this, right? It's really the principle behind this day of rest. Sabbath rest, when you take Sabbath, you essentially do three things. Well, you do a lot of things, but three things are tackled. Number one, you cease from work. Number two, you delight in the presence of God. And number three, you release control. And it's this third thing that is imperative for us to understand in relation to what we were talking about. Do you know the Israelites, they didn't just celebrate a Sabbath once a week. They actually also celebrated something called a Sabbath year that happened every 7 years. And on the Sabbath year, for an entire year, they would cease from working on the land. And not only that, they also observed a year of Jubilee, which happened after the 49th year. And this is where they would not only cease from working the lands, but they would also forgive all debts and release all slaves. And all of these were meant to be a reminder to the Israelites that, you know what, God is in control. You don't have to have control. God is in control of your work and stuff, so you can take a day off once a week. God is in control of the land and crops and food, so you can take a year off of working your land. God is in control of your debts and your money and everything and how you relate to one another, so you can forgive debts. You can release your slaves. Now, historians do argue about whether the Israelites actually observed a year of Jubilee or a Sabbath year, but that's not the point. The point is, there were these things that were set up every single Sabbath day, every single Sabbath year, every single year of Jubilee was meant to help us to learn to release control. But we don't want to do that, right? There's something therapeutic about holding on to your anger. And at the heart of it, it is this idea of holding on to control. That's why it's so hard for us to release our anger or to forgive someone, because we don't want to give up control in the circumstance or whatever artificial leverage we think we have by holding on to our anger. And the more we can practice the Sabbath, the Sabbath rest, the more we'll actually be able to say, vengeance is not for me, it's for God to repay. And we'll be able to say that and actually mean it. And when we say that and actually mean it, then we can have anger. That's how we break the pattern. Then we can have anger that turns into moral outrage. And that moral outrage will propel us to do some good, to do some change. But at some point in time, we'll be able to say, let go. Because I fully acknowledge that God is in control of the situation and that he will make things all right. That's how you break the pattern. So, practice Sabbath rest. Sabbath from your anger. Sabbath from your rage, the more you're able to practice Sabbath, the more you're able to break the pattern of anger in our lives. Stop it right in its tracks. Now, I want to end by giving 2 practical challenges to you. And I want to speak to 2 different groups of people. The first group of people are those of you who find yourselves enraged at everything all around you. You're really mad about the injustices of the world. And you're really caught up in the ecosystem of anger in our world. Your anger is not so much interpersonal, it is about everything that's happening around us. So that's the first group I want to speak to. The second group I want to speak to, your anger is less about all those things and is more interpersonal in nature. There's actually someone, you can put a name to it, there's someone that you're mad at and you're unwilling to let go of your anger. Okay, so for those 2 groups of people, actually, to be fair, they're not mutually exclusive. Most of us will fall into both camps, okay? But I'm gonna give one challenge to each group. So challenge number 1, to those of you who are mad about everything in the world, take a day off. Just take a break from the news. When I was in college, it was considered a virtue to be informed. We use the term informed a lot. If you were informed of what was happening in the world, people thought you were smart. If you were uninformed, if you didn't know anything that was happening, they thought you were dumb. That's where I was. I didn't know anything that was happening in the world. And so I felt a lot of social pressure just to know what was happening in the world. So I'm not asking you to avoid all news in general. Just take one day off. For one day, turn off all your notifications. For one day, don't go to the same channels that you usually go to. Watch some cartoons if you want, okay? Do something completely different. And this is very important for those of you who are extremely passionate about a social injustice, a social cause. It's very important for you to take a day off from thinking about your cause. To do something completely different, go on a hike, play a game, whatever, to do something to get your mind off of thinking about your cause just for one day. It's important that you do it. Because I was listening to a podcast by a guy named Mark Sayers, and he was saying social justice warriors who don't take a break, who don't Sabbath or rest, they become social justice tyrants. They become social justice tyrants. And they're very much saying the same thing we're saying right now, because social justice warriors will obsess and will think about the thing that they're so passionate about. They have this moral outrage over this issue, and they'll think about it and be angry about it and let it fester and fester and fester and fester until they desire revenge or they become this fully enraged person that gets mad at everything. Take a day off. Now, the second challenge goes to those of you who have interpersonal problems, and it is this. Be proactive about forgiveness. Be proactive about forgiveness. Anger that festers can turn into this desire for revenge. But on an interpersonal level, something else can happen. It can lead to resentment. Now, here's how resentment works. You might have a tiny little squabble, a little fight with a friend. You don't think it's a big deal. And so you sweep it under the rug. And you really don't want to make a big deal about it, but unbeknownst to you, it actually affects you. And so you go, your friendship progresses, and there's a bunch of these things, small little things that you're sweeping under the rug, but it's actually corrupting your heart. And it's gonna get to the point where you can't even look at that person. You can't even be in the same room with them. You might even hate them, but you don't know why. That's the power of resentment. And the best antidote to that is forgiveness. Now, forgiveness, I heard, is defined as surrendering the right to hurt someone in response to the way they hurt you. Forgiveness is surrendering the right to hurt someone in response to the way they hurt you. Now, that's a fancy way of saying it's surrendering your right to revenge. You see, oftentimes we get forgiveness confused with reconciliation. They're oftentimes packaged deals, but they're distinct. Reconciliation is trying to repair a relationship. Forgiveness is surrendering the right to revenge. And so if you have encountered a situation in which you were offended, maybe not deeply, but just like very shallow offense, my challenge to you is this: be proactive about forgiveness. It might seem really strange, might be quite embarrassing actually, to go to a friend and say, that tiny little joke you made, it actually offended me, it hurt me, but I forgive you for that. You gotta be proactive about forgiveness so that resentment doesn't grow to the point where you don't even know why you can't speak to your friend anymore. Now, for those of you who have this extended resentment, where you don't know why you're upset at someone, being proactive about forgiveness might actually mean that you just have to examine and reflect about your anger, about your resentment towards that person. And it might involve actually going to a counselor, going to someone that you trust to talk through these things to figure out why it is that you have this resentment towards this person. Because unless you're able to identify the source of, at least move towards understanding the source of your resentment, can you legitimately move towards forgiveness? Forgiveness, it takes a lot of intention. We got to be proactive about it. It takes a lot of work, but it's important for us to do it. So these are the two challenges. Number one, take a day off from the news. And number two, be proactive about forgiveness. I want to end here. Do not make friends with a hot-tempered person. Do not associate with one easily angered, or you may learn their ways and get yourself ensnared. When you read Proverbs, you pay attention to what it's clearly saying, but you also have to pay attention to what is being implied between the lines. Because what this proverb says very clearly is that we are not to associate with the angry person. But what it's also implying between the lines is that we are to associate with the man of peace. Now, when Jesus came to minister, people thought he would bring revolution. People thought he would fundamentally upend the whole systems of corruption that kept the Israelites oppressed under Roman rule. But he did no such thing. Instead, he would say things like, if someone has struck you, turn the other cheek. If someone sues you, give them everything. Give them the cloak off your back. He would spend time healing people that were often ignored. He would spend time with children. He would actually sit down for dinners with tax collectors, people that society hated. His was a ministry of radical peace. Associate with the man of peace, and you will learn his ways. That's what being a Christian means. That's what being a Christ follower means. You actually grow to learn and think like Jesus Christ himself. Associate with the man of peace, and you won't be ensnared. You will be freed. Not free to do anything that you want, but you'll find freedom from the trappings of sin, freedom from the trappings of this world, freedom from the trappings of this age of rage. Jesus says, come, all of you who are ensnared and trapped, and I will give you freedom. Look, I don't know where you are right now, but maybe you feel trapped. Maybe you feel like you can't get out from under yourself. You can't get out of this rage that you feel inside. You can't get out of this ecosystem of anger that's all around you. You feel trapped. I know what that feels like. I promise you. Jesus, though, invites you to walk with him, to learn his joy, to learn his grace, to learn his happiness, to learn his peace, to learn his salvation. Associate with the man of peace and find yourself freedom. Let me pray. And so, our Father, we are crying out to you as people who, unbeknownst to us, have been trapped and ensnared for whatever reason by the trappings of this world. We've been so caught up in our anger and rage that we don't even know or notice what it's done to us, and that we haven't been able to walk in the freedom of joy and peace and love because we've been so ensnared. And I confess, Lord, that many of us, myself included, have even delved into this desire for revenge. And we can't get out of this cycle for revenge that we feel towards other groups and other people. But we know it says in your word that if we confess our sins, you are faithful to forgive us. If we confess and say that we have no control in this situation, Lord, you are faithful to forgive us. And so we come to you, Lord, asking for forgiveness. In so doing, Lord, that we also ask that because we have been forgiven, help us forgive others as well. For those of us ensnared, Lord, our tendency is to try and work our way out, to try and force our way to open the traps to get out. But we know, Lord, that the only way out of these traps is to associate with you, to be in relationship with your Son. It's the power of the gospel is not just salvation in the future. The power of the gospel is salvation in the present. And so we submit ourselves to you, Lord. We submit our control. We submit our anger. We submit our rage. We submit our revenge to you. And we ask that you would make us new, no longer instruments of wickedness, but instruments of your righteousness. In Jesus Christ's name we pray.